The private dining room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Hotel in downtown Toronto had a way of making people feel like the city existed purely for their benefit. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed Lake Ontario in the distance, the water dark and still in the November evening. The chairs were upholstered in charcoal velvet. The cutlery was polished to a mirror finish every morning by a woman named Sue Yeon Park, who was 28 years old, who owed $47,000 in medical debt she had not caused, and who, on this particular Tuesday night, was pouring sparkling water for a table of men who had not once looked at her face. She had learned, early in her time at the Meridian, to make herself invisible, not the theatrical invisibility of someone trying to be noticed for their discretion, but the real kind, the kind where you moved through a room like weather, present and necessary and completely unremarked upon. She had gotten very good at it. Better than she wanted to be. The table had been set for a dinner that should not have been difficult. 4 guests. A private booking under the name of a firm called Harwick Capital. 2 partners, a junior associate who had barely spoken since arriving, and a woman who had flown in from Seoul that morning and who sat at the head of the table with her hands resting in her lap and her eyes taking in everything and giving nothing back. Her name, according to the reservation notes, was Yeon Jae-sung. The notes said she was the founder of a logistics company that operated across 12 countries. They did not say that she was one of the most quietly powerful businesswomen in South Korea, because whoever had typed the notes had not thought that mattered. The 2 Harwick partners had clearly not read the notes at all. "Tell her we're looking at a 40-60 split," said the taller one, whose name was Calloway. He had the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong about money, or from never having noticed when he was. He was addressing the associate, a young man named Fletcher, who had been translating haltingly for the past 20 minutes with the help of a phone app that kept rendering the Korean into something adjacent to English. Fletcher typed something. Held the phone across the table. Yeon Jae-sung looked at the screen for a moment, then looked at Calloway, then looked back at the screen. Something moved behind her eyes. Not confusion, Soo Yeon noticed. Not confusion at all. "She says that's acceptable," Fletcher said, though he'd had to ask the app twice. Soo Yeon refilled the water glasses on her side of the table and moved back toward the service station without hurrying. She set down the carafe. She did not look at anyone, but her mind had gone very quiet in the way it did when she was paying close attention to something, which was a habit she'd developed in the linguistics department at the University of Toronto. In the 2 years she'd spent there before her mother's diagnosis had made tuition an abstraction she could no longer afford. She had grown up in a household where 3 languages moved through the rooms, depending on who was visiting. Her mother spoke Korean at home, French on the phone with her sister in Montreal, and English at the hospital where she worked as a clerk. Soo Yeon had absorbed all 3 with the effortless appetite of a child who doesn't know yet that this is unusual. She'd added Mandarin in high school, Japanese in her first year of university, and had been halfway through a graduate-level translation seminar when everything changed. Now she carried trays of roasted duck breast and white truffle risotto through a room where a Korean businesswoman was being fed inaccurate translations by a phone app while 2 men in expensive suits negotiated the terms of what they believed was going to be a very profitable arrangement. Calloway was reaching for the folder. Soo Yeon did not mean to read what was on the top page. She was collecting an empty bread plate from the side table, and the folder was open, and the dining room had good light, the kind of warm, unambiguous light that made everything visible whether you wanted it to be or not. She saw the commission structure first, then the penalty clause, Then the clause beneath it, which was not labeled as a penalty clause but which functioned as one. A provision that, in the event Yeon Jae-sung's company failed to meet the projected quarterly benchmarks, would transfer a controlling share of the Canadian distribution rights to Howick Capital at a valuation set 18 months prior, before the market had moved the way it had moved. Soo Tu-yeon set down the bread plate very carefully. She went back to the service station. She straightened the stack of folded napkins that did not need straightening. The dining room smelled of butter and wine and the faint chemical sweetness of someone's cologne, and she stood in the corner of it and thought about what she had just read, and what it meant, and what it had nothing to do with her. At the table, Fletcher was showing Yeon Jae-sung something on the tablet. Yeon Jae-sung was nodding with the careful, neutral expression of a person who is trying to understand something in a language that is not arriving correctly. She asked a question. Fletcher typed it into the app, read the result, and said something to Calloway that made Calloway nod and say, "Tell her that clause is standard. Boilerplate." It was not boilerplate. Soo Yeon knew what boilerplate looked like. She had spent 2 years reading contracts for the translation seminar, working through the gap between what documents said and what they meant in a different legal culture, and that clause was not something anyone put in by accident. She thought about the $47,000. She thought about the job, which paid well for this kind of work, and which she needed, and which had taken her 4 months to get after her mother's second surgery had made it impossible to finish the semester. She thought about her supervisor, a precise and not unkind man who had nonetheless made it clear during orientation that servers at the Meridian did not insert themselves into client conversations under any circumstances. The junior partner, not Calloway, the other one, whose name was Dressler, was laughing at something Calloway had said. Fletcher smiled along with the performance of understanding what was funny. Yeon Jae-sung asked another question. Fletcher typed, waited, read. She wants to know about the exit provisions. Calloway smiled. It was the smile of a man who is prepared for this question. Tell her the exit provisions are flexible. We can discuss them after signing. There was a silence in Soo Yeon's chest that she recognized. It was the same silence that had been there in the hospital waiting room when the doctor had said the words secondary complication, and she had understood before her mother did exactly what they meant. A silence that was not empty, but full of something she hadn't yet decided what to do with. She picked up the carafe. She walked to the table. She refilled Calloway's glass first because that was the correct order of service, and then Dressler's, and then Fletcher's, and when she reached Yeon Jae-sung, she set the carafe down on the side table, just slightly out of the usual position, and looked at the woman directly for the first time all evening. "실례합니다," she said. "Excuse me." She kept her voice low, not a whisper but close. 계약서에 있는 위약 조항을 이해하고 계신지 여쭤봐도 될까요? 번역이 정확하지 않은 것 같아서요. The table went silent. Yeon Jae-sung turned to look at her with an expression that Soo Yeon could not immediately read. Not surprise, exactly. Something more considered than surprise. Calloway said, "Excuse me?" in a tone that was not asking for clarification. "I'm sorry," Soo Yeon said, and she was speaking to Yeon Jae-sung, not to him. "I don't want to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure. The translation has been, there are some provisions in the document that I don't think have been accurately conveyed." "She's a server," Dressler said to no one in particular. He said it in the way you'd note that a chair was a chair. Yeon Jae-sung said something in Korean. Sharp, brief, a single sentence directed at Dressler. Then she looked back at Soo Yeon and said, in careful but entirely fluent English, "Please, continue." The English landed on the table like a stone. Calloway's expression went through several things very quickly. Fletcher's went pale. Dressler looked at his water glass with sudden deep interest. Yeon Jae-sung had not needed a translator. She had understood every word of every conversation that had occurred at this table since her arrival. The phone app the haltingly offered English, the boilerplate. She had heard all of it, and she had sat with her hands in her lap and her face composed, watching two men negotiate in front of her as though she were a piece of furniture, and she had waited. Soo-yeon understood this in the space of a breath. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a person who had also, for a very long time, been underestimated. She said, in Korean, the clause on page 7, section 4, subsection C, transfers a controlling interest in your Canadian distribution rights to Harwick Capital if the quarterly benchmarks aren't met. The valuation used is from 18 months ago. That number is significantly below current market value. Yeon Jae-sung said nothing for a moment. Then she reached across the table and drew the folder toward her and turned to page 7. Calloway said, "This is highly irregular. This is a private business dinner, and I'm going to have to ask you to." "Mr. Calloway." Yeon Jae-sung did not raise her voice. She did not look up from the page. "I have been listening to your dinner conversation for 1 hour and 40 minutes. I have heard you describe this agreement as standard and flexible and in her best interest. I would like a moment to read what is actually written." The room was very quiet. The city went on, existing outside the windows, indifferent to the particular silence that had settled over the charcoal velvet chairs and the mirror-polished cutlery. Soo-yeon stood beside the table. She had nowhere to be. Or rather, she had a service station to return to and a supervisor who would eventually notice her absence from it, and a job that she was quite possibly in the process of losing. She stood there anyway. Yeon Jae-sung read. She turned to the next page. Then she looked at Soo-yeon. "Section 6, she said. Soo-yeon looked. The arbitration clause. It specifies Toronto as the jurisdiction, which, if the benchmarks trigger the equity transfer, places the resolution process under a legal framework that defaults to the acquiring party's advantage. It would make a challenge very expensive." "Yes." Yeon Jae-sung closed the folder. She set her hands on top of it. "I see." Calloway was trying to recalibrate. You could watch him doing it, the small adjustments of posture and expression, the reaching for a register of authority that kept sliding away from him. "Mems, Sung, I want to assure you that there's been no intention to—" "My English," Yeon Jae-sung said pleasantly, "is excellent. I completed my MBA at McGill. I have been conducting business in English for 19 years. She paused. "I chose not to speak it tonight because I wanted to observe how your firm operates when you believe you are not being understood." Dressler made a sound. Fletcher had gone somewhere very far away inside his own thoughts. "I've seen enough," Yeon Jae-sung said. She looked at Calloway directly. "I will not be signing this agreement. My legal team will be reviewing the correspondence from the past 6 weeks next. See what's I'd just jerth and do the same." She pushed her chair back, not quickly, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who has decided something and is at peace with the decision. She stood and smoothed her jacket and looked at Soo-yeon. She said, in Korean, "What is your name?" Soo-yeon told her, "How long have you worked here?" 14 months. "Do you have a business card?" Soo-yeon almost laughed. The sound almost made it out of her before she caught it. "I don't." "No." Yeon Jae-sung reached into her jacket pocket and produced a card. Cream stock. Minimal, Korean on one side and English on the other, and held it out. "I have a Canadian office. We're small. We're growing. I've been looking for someone who can work between the legal language of both countries." A pause. "The position has been open for some time, because the right person is very difficult to find. Su Yeon took the card. It was heavier than she expected, or perhaps her hands were not entirely steady. "Email my assistant," Yeon Jae-sung said, "this week." She said good evening to no one at the table and walked toward the door, and the dining room seemed to reorganize itself slightly around her departure, as though the room itself had been waiting for someone to leave so it could exhale. Fletcher gathered his things without speaking. Dressler left without touching the dessert menu. Calloway sat for an additional 90 seconds, alone at the table with the folder and 2 unfinished glasses of Bordeaux, and then he left too. Su Yeon began clearing the table. "It was what you did. You cleared the table. You carried the plates back to the kitchen, and you said good evening to the chef, and you hung your apron on the hook by the service entrance." The ordinary machinery of the evening resumed around her, and she moved through it on muscle memory, while something else entirely was happening in the quieter parts of her mind. Her supervisor found her in the hallway outside the kitchen. His name was Thierry, and he was a careful man, and he had an expression on his face that she recognized from the 2 or 3 times she'd seen it before, the expression of someone navigating the distance between what they were supposed to say and what they actually thought. "The table in 14, he said. "Yes, I heard." He looked at the wall above her left shoulder for a moment. "The guests have all departed. Yes, Ems Sung." Left a message at the front desk before she left, for the management. He paused. She asked that the server in the private dining room be commended. She was very specific about it. Su Yeon did not say anything. She also left an envelope. Thierry held it out. "At the desk. With your name on it." The envelope was cream-colored, the same heavy stock as the business card. Su Yeon opened it in the break room after Thierry had gone back to his station. Inside was a note in Korean, which she would read later, and a check drawn on a Korean bank's Canadian account. The amount was enough to retire the remaining balance of her mother's medical debt with something left over. Not a fortune, not a gesture, the exact number, as though Yeon Jae-sung had known it, or had made a considered estimate and erred generously. Su Yeon sat on the bench in the break room with her coat half on, and the check in her hand and the business card in her other hand, and the night outside the staff entrance windows was the kind of cold, clear November dark that makes Toronto feel simultaneously enormous and very close. She thought about her mother, who would be awake still, who always waited up. She thought about the seminar she had not finished. She thought about the word arbitration, and how she'd explained it in Korean without hesitating, because some things you learn so deeply, they stop being knowledge and become reflex. She thought about Yeon Jae-sung sitting with her hands in her lap and her face composed for 1 hour and 40 minutes, watching and waiting. She thought, not for the first time, about what it costs to be invisible and patient. How long you have to practice it before it becomes a kind of power. She put the check and the card into the inside pocket of her coat. She finished putting on her coat. She pushed open the staff entrance door and stepped out into the cold, and the city was all around her, lit and loud and indifferent, and full of possibility in the way that cities are, at night, when something has just shifted and you haven't yet had time to be afraid of what comes next. She started walking.